So, Rich, today we are joined with a very special guest, a friend of ours, someone who's been on the show before. Who are we joined by, and what are we talking about?
Well, today, Dr. Ed Epperly is back with us, and today we're going to be talking about the trials of Reverend Kelly.
And this is going to go into the Villisca axe murder case. And Dr. Ed is the professor of the Villisca case.
Sure is.
He is the professor. He is the guy. Ed, how are you doing? And thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm doing fine, and I'm excited about being here.
Yes, our last
I'll always like
episode.
to talk about Villisca.
Absolutely. Our last episode, we had double digit numbers of people ask for your return. People wanted to hear more from you. And I even heard from a couple of people saying that they watched the episode twice because they enjoyed it so much. So I'm sure that the audience will be very excited to see you this morning. But with that, I want to start is with the Kelly case. For anybody who hasn't watched any of our prior Villisca stories or hasn't seen anything from you or maybe read the book, can you give us a brief outline of how we got to the Kelly trials?
Sure. The Villisca murder happened on 9th or 10th of June, 1912 in Villisca, Iowa, which is a small town, 2,000 people in far southwestern Iowa. Uh, Somebody entered the house, proceeded to bludgeon to death 6 children and 2 adults, the parents and their 4 children, and then 2 neighbor girls who were visiting that night. And that had been nothing like that in the state of Iowa, or probably in the nation in some ways before that. And so it created a great uproar. And actually, in the city itself has never been the same. I mean, the town is there. It's half the size it was in 1912, but it's there. And still remembered. You can walk down the street and anybody you meet will know about it. They may have the wrong idea or they may be correct, but they know about it. It caused a split in the community, which is another part of the story. There were multiple trials, and the primary suspect initially was that it was a serial killer. There had been some similar murders in the Midwest before that. And then gradually, within a month, that had pretty much faded away, although there have always been people who believed that. In our day and age, there is a resurgence of that idea. I think if you would ask people who have watched podcasts and people who have been to Villisca, they will tend to believe that it was a serial killer, and it may well have been. It hasn't been proven one way or another. But the primary suspect became, well, there were two. One was a banker in town, uh, State Senator F.F. Jones, a wealthy man. He had a lot of enemies in town. He was an arrogant fellow, and that was part of it. But also, a detective came to town in 1914, 2 years after the murder. Wilkerson, James N. Wilkerson, he worked for the Burns Detective Agency, and he built the case against F.F. Jones. That case fell apart in front of a grand jury in 1917. There was a slander suit, which the detective won and Jones lost. So the local population in 1917 believed that the grand jury was going to indict F.F. Jones. The problem with that was that when they brought witnesses under oath and in pain of perjury, uh, they did not say what the detective said they were going to say. The detective painted a picture of Jones, and then the witnesses did not back that up. So that case fell apart. The grand jury is secret, of course, so nobody in the general public knew what had been what had transpired. And Wilkerson presented it as a case that Jones had used his influence and power to squash the case. Um, the grand jury then turned to the only person that was tried for the murder, and that was a fellow at that time was known as Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly. The Lynn was a nickname that he had contrived for himself and was a contraction or a narrowing of his mother's name, Jacqueline. That was her last name. He had been born in England. Both his father and his grandfather had been preachers. He had been a very early follower of the Salvation Army. He'd been involved. He was a friend of Gypsy Smith, who was a gypsy who had converted to Christianity in England and became a kind of a Billy Graham of the day. Gypsy Smith came to America several times, preached, and so on. And Kelly was a boy evangelist, and I suspect that meant he preached with Gypsy Smith a while. Then he was in the Nonconformist Church. He was a Congregationalist, not a Church of England member, and he got called by the Methodists in North Dakota. The Synod in North Dakota called him as a Methodist, and he came in 1904. Came to America from England, very poor, was married, had no family, just his wife. And the two of them settled in North Dakota. And then he went on a kind of a tour of the Midwest because he didn't stay very long in any community. He was in North Dakota, and he moved to Minnesota, he moved to Iowa, he moved to Oklahoma, he moved to Kansas, Nebraska. And when the murder occurred, a month before that, he had moved to a little town about 50 miles northwest of Villisca, and he had switched. He was going to be entering the seminary of the Presbyterian Church in Omaha in September of 1912. He came to Macedonia because the seminary, since he was poor and needed help, they got him a church in Macedonia for the summer. So he would have a salary and could preach until he would not be ordained, but he could preach until he could enter the seminary. He then was also charged with going to Villisca every other week during the summer, by train, of course, and he would preach at two country churches. One was in a schoolhouse, and the other had a small church. They were both Presbyterian, northwest of Villisca. And so on the, let's see, get my dates right, that would have been Saturday. It would have been Saturday night of the 8th of June. Sunday would be the 9th, Monday the 10th. So that's right. Saturday night, the 8th of June, about supper time, about 6 o'clock, he came in on the train. No one in Villisca had ever seen him. He had never been to Villisca. He was a tiny man, about 5'2" and weighed 119 pounds. When he was arrested in 1917, they took the measurements, so that's where that's pretty certain that that's what he was. Approximately that's the way, about 120 pounds and about 5'2". He came by himself, and his wife stayed in Macedonia. He was picked up by a man named Louis Enerson, Norwegian fellow, and taken out to Lou's brother, Henry Enerson, who was a farmer, had two young girls, preschool age, a wife, and a mother. I don't know if it was his mother or his wife's mother, but He was either a mother-in-law or a mother. They lived on the farm, and he was going to stay there overnight. He did that. Had a very unusual evening. They had supper and they talked a while. And the way he related to the children, the two girls, was strange enough that both the mother and the grandmother were very concerned. And so they went to bed. Kelly had a downstairs bedroom. They were upstairs in the farmhouse. But the Norwegian grandmother was so upset that she brought her rocker out and put it at the head of the stairs and sat there rather than go to bed because she was worried that he might come upstairs. And she could hear him walking, pacing in his room downstairs for, as she put it, hours. The next morning, he did his preaching in one church. In the afternoon, he did his preaching in the other church. He was brought back to Villisca after his afternoon service, got there about late in the afternoon, 5 o'clock, and went to the Presbyterian manse where he was going to stay overnight. And he stayed the night of the murder in the Presbyterian church, which is 2.5 blocks west on the same street as the murder house. So he was in that vicinity. Um, Now, nobody would suspect him of the murder. Nobody did at the time, except he was so obsessed with it. He wrote letters, sometimes as many as 4 a day, to different officials, uh, the town marshal, the county attorney, the county sheriff, the state of Iowa district or attorney general, detectives who were working on the scene. And they talked about, he said he couldn't sleep and he went walking to try to help him sleep. And he was thinking about a sermon that was going to preach, and it was based on the Bible phrase "slay utterly." And he thought he heard the thud of the axe when he walked by the house. He said the killer was disturbed uh, during the or after the murders by a couple that walked by, and he went out, stepped out on the front porch. He's talking about the murderer, and the detectives started to explore him a little bit as a suspect in the summer of 1912. But the general public was not aware because he left on the train. He came back 2 or 3 Sundays during the summer, and they didn't realize he was involved quietly. There was a quiet investigation going on from about a month after the murder until 1913.
You had just mentioned the Bible verse "slay utterly." I've never heard that before. That's really interesting. Did he do this? Do you think that he possibly did this crime, Kelly? Because in our last episode, I asked you if you had to bet money on it, who was it? And you had mentioned it was possibly Kelly. If it was Kelly, do you think that he did this for religious reasons, or was this some type of psychotic?
No, it was a sexual murder, in my judgment, sexually motivated. I'll I'll move away from the kind of the systematic talk of Kelly and let me jump here and there about him. One thing was he was sexually disturbed. Uh, the marriage was never consummated because he was impotent. And I got that on. I don't think I've seen that anywhere, but I interviewed Oscar Winston, who was the prosecuting attorney, the county attorney during the Kelly trial in 1917. And he had gotten um, close both to Kelly and to his wife, Laura. And he was very sympathetic with Laura because she was very loyal to him and stood by him through all of this uproar, which went on for years. And he cost me some documents because he had some papers, and I said, "Well, could I see them?" No, I don't want you to. Well, how come? And well, she might still be alive. This was back in the '60s when I was first starting, and I wouldn't want to bring it back up if she's alive. Wouldn't do any good. Kelly's dead. There's no resolution to it, and I just wouldn't. She went through so much, and so they talked, and she said the marriage has never been consummated. That he was impotent and remained so. And at the same time, he gave evidence of having a second life that she wasn't aware of. Uh, he was caught or seen window peeking a lot in nearly every community. They suspected him of it because he would be roaming the town late at night. I mean, he would leave at 10 o'clock and be gone for 2 or 3 hours. And the people wondered, what's he doing? Why is he walking like that? Actually, when he got to Macedonia back before the murder, he came in middle of May, about a month before the murder, and he was in the Presbyterian manse, the church home that they had for the minister. And Billy Miller was a druggist. He also was a little guy. Billy Miller was a little bigger than Kelly, but not very big. But he was a druggist, a pharmacist, and in town businessman, and was sitting in his living room one night about a little before 10, and he reading the paper, he said, and he heard somebody walking by the side of the house, which he didn't think anything about because it was a vacant lot, and people oftentimes cut through it, and so he just noted that somebody was walking outside the house, and the footsteps stopped, and that caused him to wonder, and so he got up and leaned out a window to look down the side of the house. And here was Kelly, who was his minister now, standing in just outside of the pool of light that comes out of the window, watching his wife get ready for bed. And he yells out the window, "Get out of here, you son of a bitch," and went out the front door. And the neighbor was aroused by the shouting, I guess, and the two of them ran to the end of the lot, and this figure disappeared into the next block where the manse was, went running home, so to speak. It was pretty obvious. Kelly's a pretty recognizable guy at 5'2". So he was pretty confident that it was Kelly. He didn't ever grab him and look at him, but he was pretty sure it was Kelly. He was new to town and so on. Well, this Villisca was a real setup for that, because when he got to the Presbyterian minister's home that night after there'd been a children's service in the Presbyterian church. I got to keep my churches straight. The two of them are right across the street from each other. But he was working to be a Presbyterian. He had been a Methodist, but they talked for a while, and then the pastor and his wife and children went out and slept in a tent outside the house that night. The pastor had some kind of a throat condition. His name was Ewing. He's from Michigan, actually. Had it was a chronic thing, and during the investigations and all, and I believe it was 1918, just after the trials, he had left Villisca and was in a little town in Iowa named Whatshire, which is in south of Iowa City. Interesting name. He went to the University of Iowa hospitals to have his tonsils removed. And they did that, but they could not control the bleeding, and he bled to death. So he had a serious condition, and he thought the night air was better for it. So he excused himself. He and the family went out. I left Kelly in the house alone. And he knew nobody in town. Nobody knew him. It was a perfect situation to go window peeking. And so he went for a walk, thinking about his sermon. If we can jump ahead again, he gave a confession. It would, I don't think, stand up today because he was pretty obviously manipulated by the police. We can talk about that later. But in the confession, he gave two confessions. One, he was grilled all night. We're now about 4 days away from the trial. He's been arrested, been held all summer, going to be tried in September of 1917. He for the murder. And they were trying desperately to get him to confess. And so they put him under a lot of pressure, started at right after supper or something like 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock, I don't know. And they had four. Havner was the state attorney general. He was there. He had taken over the case and was prosecuting it. There was a local sheriff and a deputy sheriff from another town, and one of Havner's investigators, a man named Risden, who got control of the axe, and that's where Don Brown and I, who were working on the case, got control of the axe.
Where is the axe now? Where is
the axe now? Is at the Montgomery County Historical
Society?
No, Montgomery County Historical Center, which is really, I don't know where it gets its funding, but it's better funded than any historical group I ever saw. They've got a fancy building, and they've got the guy that runs it, former teacher. He must be 65, I suppose. He's got a lot of enthusiasm, and he's got quite a collection of all kinds of material. Got a lot of Villisca material.
I wonder if he's got Joe Moore's skull that Bert threw down the sewer. I'm just kidding.
But anyway, he claimed that he was walking down the middle of the street, and he saw a light in the window. It would be off to his left. He's walking east, and the house is on the southwest corner of the block. And then there's a street that runs north and south, very sparsely settled beyond that. And that's 2.5 blocks east of the Presbyterian manse where he was sleeping, supposedly. And he said he saw a light in that window, and he could see two children going to bed, getting dressed, undressed. I don't know what they were doing. And he said, just then the Lord's voice came to him and said, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." And I raised my hands and said, "Yea, Lord, thy servant heareth." And he said, it was like I was in a trance. This is a paraphrase of his second confession. He finally confessed under pressure and gave a confession. But then later that morning, he was kind of relaxed now. He had kind of removed that burden, and he was in his cell, and Oscar, Winston, the county attorney, came and talked to him and said, well, and he said, well, I feel better. I've gotten that off my chest. And he said, I'd like to tell you what really happened. And Oscar, okay. And so he did. And Oscar said, well, can I bring in a stenographer to take it down? And they did. And now the state had two confessions. One was got the night before, and then one from Oscar. And the trouble with it is that two is worse than one because they weren't identical. He changed elements of the two. The state was forced to use the one that he gave to the state attorney general.
What were the
And
differences between the two confessions?
yeah, well, I would have to look that up. The differences were fairly minor, but any difference was a problem. The second confession was much more relaxed, more intimate. He was on the verge of a psychotic breakdown when he made the first confession. He was crying, and they were shouting at him, threatening him, um, and he finally broke down. He kept confessing for fires that he had lit in the town of Sutton, Nebraska, a year before that he had been preaching there, and they didn't want to know. I said, "Oh, forget about the fires," So it was a long, rambling, disjointed description of going in the house and killing them. But his confession to Oscar was much shorter. Uh, it's in the book. I followed Oscar's confession rather than the state's confession. But in Oscar's confession, he said, the Lord provided. I was in a trance. I walked, there was the axe, and I picked up the axe, and he said he went to the front door and in the house. Now, I think in the other one, he was going in the back door. That's a difference that I remember. And he said, I went up the stairs, and he said it was like I was climbing Jacob's ladder. And the Lord's voice said, work to be done. And here were the parents, and I killed them both. And then the Lord's voice came back again and said, oh, more to be done. And I went in the south room and I killed the 4 children. And I went downstairs and I was tired. He said, I was just exhausted. And I was standing there in the living room, and the Lord's voice came a final time, said, still more to be done. And I went in that back room and killed the 2 kids. And he said, I stayed in the house until the sun was just cracking the horizon. It was still dark, but you could see the sun was starting to rise. It was a cloudy day, so it would have been the clouds were lightening up in the east. And he said, I went home, went back to the manse, and I picked up my suitcase and went down to the railroad depot and left. And he left at 5:19. Now the state made a lot out of the confession. The jury dismissed it. I interviewed a jury member named Bass. George Bass was on the jury. And he said, we didn't believe the confession. He said Kelly had an obvious bruise on his face. And we believed that it was beaten out of him, that and to a real extent it was the confession they were using. But the other confession was much different in terms of why he gave it and when he gave it and things like that.
What other info did you get out of the jury member that you interviewed? I haven't seen really much of any reports on the jury. Like that to me is new information that you interviewed the jury member. I'd like to hear about that.
Well, I didn't get very much uh, because he said that the jury was pretty much convinced that Kelly was a mentally ill guy who might have hallucinated that he did the murder, but they didn't really think he could do it. He was so little, so small. They uh, they were doubtful of it, and some of them were supporting the detective who was running a campaign to convince the public that Kelly was innocent and being railroaded to the conviction by Jones and Jones's supporters. Um, the town was split between the wealthy who supported Jones and the poor who supported Kelly.
And you're talking
And the
about F.F. Jones, is that right?
F.F. Jones, yeah.
Okay.
When I talk, Albert was his son. Uh, the the reason the town believed Jones was behind the murder was multiple. One, they were business competitors. They both had um, farm implement dealerships. Jones was also a banker and also a state senator. Moore had been his crack salesman. And 5 years, 5 years before the murder, had left and went to got an independent store competing with him. So there was business animosity. It was heightened by the fact that nobody knew this, but the John Deere Plow Company, which is still John Deere, biggest tractor manufacturer in the world, I imagine, they approached him more and said, if you will leave Jones' employee, we will loan you money at a favorable rate and you can open your own store. And we'll give you our franchise. We'll take it from Jones and give it to you. And that was a valuable piece of merchandise to have a John Deere farm implement. Now, they didn't have farm implements like we do now, but they still sold they sold reapers and they sold binders and no tractors in 1912, but lots of smaller equipment. And so he did that. Now, I don't know how much of that Jones personally knew, but he probably felt somebody's backing him. He wasn't making enough money to do that. So there was a business conflict. But the other thing that was really the key factor was that Joe Moore, the murdered man, was arranging meetings with Albert Jones's wife. That's Joe Moore. That's F.F. Jones's son. He had two sons, but one of them had been killed in a railroad accident. He was a brakeman and got caught between two cars down in the Villisca railroad yards back in the 90s, 15 years before the murders. And he lingered for several months, but lung had been punctured by a rib, and they ended up getting pneumonia and died. So Albert was his only son that survived. A young school teacher, Dona Bentley, came to town in, I don't know the exact date, I'd have to look it up, but 3 years before the murder. She was teaching elementary school in a rural school, lived in town, went out to teach. And Albert was kind of a pudgy, as somebody said, he wouldn't take a breath without his father's permission. And somebody said he was kind of droll. We interviewed a woman for the movie. I didn't interview them, but I had the transcript of a woman who was a child at the time and grew up in Villisca and stayed in Villisca. And she said that Albert was kind of droll. He had a little sense of humor. But she said that we always said that he put his brain in his dresser drawer, and when he left, he took it out and put it on his head. He wasn't thought of as a sort of a shining light in the town, but he had money and he had social position. And Dona Jones, I interviewed a lawyer who said, Dona, I said, well, how would you describe Dona? And he said, she was a good looking woman. You can bet, how did he say that? She was a hell of a good looking woman. You can bet your shirt on that. And she wasn't, I got a picture of her in the book too. She is she was a nice looking woman, dark haired, not too tall. Um, but she had a strange year. Sometime in the year before the murder, she started accepting calls from married men and one unmarried man in the community. And she accepted them on the phone, of course, which I don't know if she was so naive that she didn't realize that Central girls could listen in to any phone call. Uh, they, but anyway, she talking, and the talk, the girls were after the murder brought before a grand jury and questioned. Did they make calls? Yes, they called several times, sometimes twice a week. Someone would call. Did they? What did they talk about? Well, they were just arranging meetings. And Joe would say, "Is it all right if I come over now?" And she would say, "Sure, he's not here," or "No, you can't come. He's here." And some of those meetings happened when he wasn't in town. He being uh, Albert Jones. It culminated in a fight 4 months after the murder in October of 1912, where the light came on and the woman in the switchboard made the connection, and it wasn't a call coming through, but there was the phone had been knocked off its hook in the Jones residence, and there was a fight going on between Albert Jones and a man named Albert Davies, who was a younger guy, an insurance salesman. And apparently, Albert came home at the wrong time and caught them. It's nothing. I have no evidence of what they were doing, but it was not appropriate in 1912 for a non-relative to visit a woman alone if her husband wasn't aware of it or there. And so they got in a fight, and the girl is listening in at the switchboard, and she can hear furniture tipping over and shouts and things. And all of a sudden, she heard a pistol shot, and she didn't know what that meant. But the fight stopped when the pistol shot occurred. And then that next week, Albert Davies, the insurance salesman, showed up on the streets of Villisca with his hand bandaged up and his thumb. The story that was officially told by the newspaper was that Albert was having had bought a new horse, or had a new horse, or had rented a new horse that was fractious, jumpy, it would rear in the air and things. And he had his thumb in the harness ring, putting on the harness when the horse reared and nearly tore off his thumb. But everyone in town by this time, because every girl at the switchboard had intimate friends who she would share information with, and they would say, "No, I won't tell anybody." But they had one or two intimate friends, and the chain went on, and by 6 hours after it had been heard, it was known by everybody in town. It was not you think the computer is fast. Get
You
on
had brought
a line.
you Ed, you had brought up the detective agency just a few minutes ago. I want to toss it to Rich because I know Rich has some questions about the detective agency. So Rich, I'm going to toss it to you.
Well, the detective agency, the Burns Detective Agency, we don't have that situation here in 2026. But back at that time, detective agencies were kind of a big deal, and Pinkerton was one of the biggest, and we all hear about that. And the Burns Detective Agency was another, and these people would get involved in cases like the Lizzie Borden case that we've
Yeah.
reported on so many times that happened around here. Within a day after the murder in Fall River, the
That's
Borden
true.
sisters hired the Pinkerton Company.
Hmm.
And the police were outraged that someone else, somebody who was investigating besides them, and they went and hired someone from Providence, Rhode Island, by the name of McHenry, out of the McHenry Detective Agency, and what his job was to find out what the Pinkerton guy was doing. So, detective agencies back then were prevalent and often used, and we don't see that these days. But
No.
in Villisca, that was a big deal back then.
Oh yes. They uh, uh, they were there. The reporters got there the day of the murder. It's amazing how we don't think of it that they have that kind of transportation, but they did. The trains ran everywhere in 1912, passenger trains, and they stopped at all of the towns so that you could move quickly. And reporters came from Kansas City, came from Des Moines, came from Omaha, and then all of the little towns had newspapers. Uh, the detectives generally, some of them who were close by came streaming in. You had uh, the detective agencies, which might well send a detective to see if is this a case we ought to try to get in with, and that may have happened to Burns, but the state hired Burns at the time of the murder, and that would have been during the week after the murder, partly because the state in those days did not have a trained detective force. You had the state attorney general, a man named that'll come back to me. He was he had assistants, and these were mostly county sheriffs who had retired, and he would have one or two that worked for him on a permanent basis. But they covered the whole state of Iowa, so they certainly came in and were involved, but they needed more manpower, and so they hired the Burns agency. They also hired a agency in Kansas City. Burns was located nationally, but they had a Kansas City office, and then Kansas City is a little over 100 miles south of Villisca, and so they brought in the Hayes agency, which was a Kansas City firm, and some of the detectives came in freelance. They just came in and started studying the case in the hopes that they would be hired. Or if they could solve the case, they could get so much publicity. They could form an agency. They could hire people, and they could get jobs. That's what happened to Burns. Burns cracked the William J. Burns himself cracked the Los Angeles Times bombing that took place first part of the century. It was a labor dispute, And he got enough publicity out of it that he became a national agency. The big one, as you say, was Pinkerton, which grew out of the Civil War. But anyway, there was a third, the rather than formal detectives, there were a fair number of local citizens who became kind of semi-involved, partly because they knew everybody, they knew the police, and they were good friends to some of them. The county sheriff would have a cadre of friends, and they would offer to help out. They would, if they had a car, they would drive the person to go out to interview somebody. Oh no, I'll do it, and then they pretty soon they're rummaging around and acting like they're part of the investigation, just out of curiosity. Um, the one that I've fella came in. I don't have his name. I don't know if I ever had it. They wrote a little article in the paper about him because he came in from somewhere and he offered to be hired to work on the case, but said he would bring his own clues with him. And the county board of supervisors who did the hiring for things like that said, well, they were a little suspect of a detective that brought his clues with him, and so he didn't get hired. But several would retain for a day or two to to run down a particular piece. They stayed with the Burns agency, and Wilkerson, who became a permanent fixture, he was in the town for 3 years, almost lived there. Uh, he um, he was a Burns operative. He was working for the Burns agency. And everybody knew that. He was nothing secret. And the state had hired him to come. He came in 1914, 2 years afterwards.
Ed, I'm a little bit curious to hear about the Kelly trials, the beginning of the Kelly trials. Can you set it? Can you set the scene for me? What did these trials look like? The two of them. What was he charged with, and what was the evidence that was brought against
Mm-hmm.
him, and what was the outcome? If you could kind of give me the rundown of these two trials.
Sure. Kelly was charged with the murder of Lena Stillinger. Now, it's obvious that he was guilty. If he was guilty of killing Lena, he was guilty of killing everybody. And I'm sure that they would have amended the charge, but the state felt that the part of the evidence against Kelly was his sexual aberration, which I referred to. He had, um, well, we'll go. Let me jump to answer your question, and then go back and show how the state built that case, what they liked about it. But one thing was the way that Lena had been posed in the bed. She was the oldest girl, and in her mother's statement, mother had said uh, she was almost grown, and she was a big, hardy. The Stillingers were big people, tall and heavy set. Um, the father was, and I'm not so confident, but I don't know the mother very well. I'm not sure I've ever seen a picture of her, but the father was, and the I've met a sister, and she was old then, but she was a tall, broad-shouldered woman,
Did you say that you
and
met the
Lena
sister?
was,
Did you say that you met the sister?
yes,
What was that
yes.
experience like?
Well, that was kind of a flop. You interviews are unpredictable, and she was old and she had a heart condition, and I was, fools walk in where angels fear to trod, and I didn't know any of that. This was on one of my first visits to Villisca, but I found out that she was still alive and lived in this house, and so I went up, knocked on the door, and she came out to the porch, and I explained what I was doing, working, studying the case, and I understood she was an older sister, Edith, and she, yes, when did that happen? Now she wasn't Dottie. She was just she hadn't, that had been put away in her life, and she had lived her own life, good or bad. I don't know anything about it. But she said, what year was that? And I said, well, it was 1912. And she said, oh, 1912. That's the year I graduated from high school. And uh, she one seemed to know almost nothing about the murder. And maybe she had blotted it out as being too traumatic. I don't know. That's out of my field. I wouldn't recognize whether she was doing that or not. Uh, or maybe it seemed to me like she had just pretty much gone on and led a normal life. And she said, I really don't remember much about it. She said, I went to the funeral, but she said, we were just in the park, a big crowd in the park. I was kind of at the back, couldn't hear what they said. And, it was a flop as an interview. I got very little information from her. On the other hand, you meet somebody that you never, uh, you didn't think they knew much about it, and I interviewed a guy named Henry. That's his last name. I can't remember his first name.
I
He
have
was a
one more
reporter.
question. Ed, I have one more
Okay,
question on
sure.
the sister, and then we can go into Henry. And my question is, uh, if you had the opportunity to ask her one question right now, what would you ask her?
Mm.
All these years later, I'm assuming that this was probably in the 60s or 70s that you talked to her.
Yeah, 60s.
60s,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Uh, I think I would ask her to uh, tell me about her sisters that were killed, because I think she knew that. She lived with them for 12 years and 9 years, and she uh, probably had memories about that. I if I were doing it now, I've learned a little bit over the years, and if I were doing it now, after we had that initial 2 3 minute conversation that was non-productive, I might have asked her, well, how would you describe Lena, and how would you describe Ina, and what was your family life like? And as background to the murder, those are the things that are very hard to get. You can find a document that has statements made, but uh, the everyday things, the routine things that really are useful for understanding what was going on. Um, that's what Henry was, a Des Moines Register reporter, but at the time of the trial, the Kelly trial, he had been a cub reporter for the Council Bluffs Nonpareil, which is an old newspaper still there. And his job at night was to stay in the office until the telephone call came in from their reporter who was at the trial. And the reporter had written a story, and then he dictated it to Henry. And he gave a description of what that was like. He said, I was sitting at my desk, which was way back in the newsroom. He said, we had 3 rows of desks, and lots of people worked there in those days, and I was the only person in the building. He said I had a key to lock out, and the room was dark except for just a green lamp at my desk. And here comes this story in which Kelly's confession, where he talks about God's voice coming and killing the people, a variation of what I told you earlier. Uh, he said it was frightening. He said I was a 17-year-old, 18-year-old cub reporter. He said I got duties like this at that time, and he gave me a 2-hour interview. We put it on tape, but we were using an old wire recorder, and it was so bad that I've got a transcript, but there are a lot of missing parts because the machine just didn't produce them. But anyway, I think I would have asked Edith about their family life, about, see, I think that I shouldn't say things that I don't know, but my impression is that Stillinger was a fallen away Mormon. He had been not in Mormons that went to Utah, but they split back in the Midwest, and one group stayed in the Midwest, and that's the Reorganized Church of the Latter-day Saints. But it's a Mormon offshoot. And I don't think he was a practicing Mormon at the time. There are quite a few in Iowa, but and a lot more in Missouri. Independence is kind of the center of that group, Independence, Missouri. And I had the impression that he was an austere, rather stern father. He became a leader in the anti-Jones group. They used him as a kind of a, they would bring up, they were having a public meeting. They had lots of public meetings, and they would bring him up on stage, and he would introduce Wilkerson, who then would give the primary speech of the evening. And he was a Iowa farmer, and he got better at it, but he was a little nervous, it sounded like, at first, and things like that. But he was also wealthy, and he was also well, he was nobody's fool. They were raising money, and they wanted him to give money, and he said the detectives haven't done a damn thing, and if they show some evidence, I'll give money. I've already given money, and I'll give more, but I'm not just pouring it down the rat hole until I find out if they're actually doing something or they can find something. He was critical, judgmental like that.
Ed, could you take a moment to go into the evidence brought against Kelly in the trials and then
Yeah.
outline how the trials went on?
Yeah. I will, let me, the evidence was relatively, the first part was what I've alluded to, and I won't go into that anymore, but his sexual aberration fit the way he tried very hard to get either a live or a picture or a through the window view of women undressing or undressed. And that was not known at the time of the murder, except we talked about Billy Miller, the druggist. He saw it, but that he didn't realize that was any way connected to the murder, so he didn't tell anybody until later the investigators found it. The first piece of evidence that surfaced was in about a month after the murder, when a lawyer from Macedonia who was acquainted with Billy Miller and had talked to him about the fact that Kelly sent a bloody shirt to the laundry, in Council Bluffs the week of the murder. The way it worked was Billy Miller's drugstore was a drop point. People would wear boiled front shirts and starched collars for Sunday, and that's all they would wear it, just the one day. And so they would wrap that up in a bundle and put their name on it and put it in a hamper outside the drugstore. And Billy Miller would, on a certain day, I think it was on Wednesday or Thursday, he would take that, and that would be put on a train and sent to the laundry in Council Bluffs. They would get it, register it, and charge it to Billy Miller and send it back after they'd done it to the drugstore in Macedonia. Billy would then hold it behind the desk, and people would come in, pick it up, and they would pay the charge, which covered the laundry and a fee for Billy doing the coordination. On the week of the murder, that would have come back on Saturday, I suspect, so they could have it for Sunday. On the week of the murder, he had a package wrapped up from the laundry that said will be claimed. It didn't, and it had a price, what it was charged. Because there wasn't any identification, it had been taken directly to the laundry, and they sidestepped Billy and put it in the laundry chute, the drop box that they had at the laundry. And the checker took it, labeled it, returned to Macedonia, there's no name on it, and it was a bloody shirt. It had been washed, but the blood had not come out. It had stained the shirt. And she sent it to the laundry. They did what they could do with it, wrapped it up, put the charge on it, sent it back to Macedonia, thought nothing about it. Billy was curious because he had never had one that hadn't been labeled, hadn't been sent through him. And so he unwrapped it. And it was addressed to Kelly. I mean, the shirt, well, no, excuse me, I'm wrong. He realized there was no identification. He wrapped it back up, but he waited until he see who picked it up, and Kelly picked it up. And he had looked at it. Well, again, he didn't make the connection, really. I mean, he didn't realize that. I don't even if he knew Kelly had been in Villisca that night. I don't know. But so he hadn't said anything about it, but he did talk to an attorney who was a friend. They just chatted over coffee, I suppose. And the attorney was a little more suspicious, and so he contacted the state. And the state, in the fall of 1912, now that it had drifted on till about, I don't know, October, 3-4 months after it happened, they did a follow-up. They sent an agent to there, and they interviewed the girl who took in the laundry, and they interviewed the owner of the laundry, and so on. And that was the first piece of evidence against Kelly. One of the reasons they did that is because they had been getting all of these letters from Kelly in which he talked about the murder, and he offered to help, claiming that he had been a operative for Scotland Yards when he was in England. I don't believe that, but Kelly could tell tales if it served his purpose. He wanted to get in on the investigation, and 2 weeks after the murder, he was back in Villisca to preach again. And he told the Presbyterian minister on Monday morning, he didn't go on the early train, he went on a later train, said, I'd like to see the house. And the minister said, well, it's just down this road. We can walk down there. And just as they got there, they met a group of investigators who were going into the house. State Attorney General Sampson, or Assistant Attorney General Sampson was there, and I think 3 others. And the 4 of them they said, well, come on in with us. And they would do that in 1912. And so the 2 pastors walked through the house, which had been cleaned, and there's nothing there really. But Kelly was just, for one thing, he got down under the bed and he came out with a little vial, small glass, that he had found. And he thought it was a clue. Maybe he thought it was chloroform or something that they had used to knock everybody out. Well, the house had been cleaned, the beds had been removed, and all of that. I think Kelly went under the bed with the vial myself, but I don't have any evidence for that, but I have a strong suspicion of that. He also, there was a mar on an upstairs the trim, and he thought it was a thumbprint. And so Kelly went up and put his thumbprint to match it to see if his thumbprint matched it. There was no evidence whether the authorities even noticed him doing it, but somebody did, and it got recorded and so on. And so they had been investigating him through the summer because of this obsession with the murder and his coming back. One of his other letters claimed that on one of these trips, he left the house again and he went down to the murder house and was in the backyard looking it over at night to see, and he talked about that the killer had an accomplice. Never heard that before. But anyway, so when they heard about the bloody shirt, they went and investigated it. And in late fall, in December of 13, Kelly had left no, I want to get myself straight here, my times. This would have been in early 1913. Kelly had left Villisca. Kelly was still in the seminary his first year, and they had gotten him a job in Carroll, Iowa, which is north and east of Villisca ways. A little bigger town. Carroll is probably close to 10,000, I suspect. Anyway, he was preaching at a Presbyterian church that was without a minister. They had fired the minister and they brought him in as a replacement preacher. So he'd go to seminary through the week and then he would go to the Carroll to give his speeches. And the state had decided, do we have this bloody shirt? Should we arrest him? Should we have a grand jury? And Colson, that was the attorney general at the time, he and the county attorney said, well, it's pretty thin. We don't have much except his sexual problems and a bloody shirt. And a lot of people cut themselves in those days. They shaved with straight razors. Maybe that's not enough to do it. We know where he is. We can get him if we need him. Let's see what happens. So they thought about arresting him in 1912 and didn't. By 1913, we got in the second element that got tried. He invited two girls who were high school age girls over to his apartment. He had gotten an apartment, a one room in the second floor of a doctor's home, a Dr. Spaulding and his wife rented the room to him as a courtesy to the church, really, because the fired pastor refused to leave the man's cave. His contract kept him there until June, and so he wasn't going to leave. And they argued, but finally decided the best thing is put Kelly up somewhere else. And so they persuaded this doctor to take him. While he was there during the spring semester of 1913. While he was there, he invited these two girls. One was named Calloway and the other was named Struck. But both of them were like high school freshmen or sophomores, and they came singly. They didn't come together. And he spent a hour or more trying to persuade each one of them to take off their clothes so he could sketch them. He was an artist and he was working, he didn't have any models and he wanted to sketch them. Well, they were reluctant to do that, as you might suspect. But in the process, he tried to persuade them. He said, nudity is in the Bible and great artists always do nude figures. And he pulled out a folder which had soft porn and sounded like a little harder stuff, and as a evidence that this was done, this was common. And the only thing that was mentioned in it was the uh, oil painting. This would be a print of this oil painting, September Morn. Does that name mean anything to you guys?
It does not.
Not I.
Do you? No, nothing.
Well, you can look it up after you go off the air. Um, the September Morn is what I would call saloon art, of a nude figure, um, done by an artist. It was, I believe, French. I believe it was done by a French artist. Uh, and it depicts a young woman nude, and she's standing in a pool of water, and it's a pond, and it only comes up over her ankles, and she's using her hands to cover uh, strategic places, and it hit the United States. It was. Uh, I thought you could do things like that.
Yeah, I just looked it up just to show Rich, just so that we were understand. It's not too bad, guys. I'll put it up on the screen. You'll see
but
it.
the it was, I believe, the victim of a suppression trial. You know, whether or not it was obscene. Um, the only thing else that seemed to be significant about it, there was some doggerel verse that was written uh, when some newsman did it, I suppose. I have no idea who did it. I think I remembered. Please, sir, don't think I'm bad nor bold, but where it's deep, it's awfully cold, as explanation as to why she's standing exposed. Anyway, he had that picture or that copy and other things too, drawings and so on. And he used that as evidence to persuade them to do that. Well, what happened was that he swore them to secrecy, and but both of them told a relative. One told a sister, and they told the mother, and the mother got the women of the church aroused, and 4 or 5 of them came and met in the, I don't know, if it was in Kelly's room or downstairs at the doctor's, and this in the spring, and laced into him, and Kelly gave as good as he got. I mean, he denied it. No, they just made that up. You know, I haven't done anything like that, and I wouldn't do anything like that. And you better uh, uh, look at your own children and what they're thinking and doing, rather than worry about me. I didn't do any of that. Well, it was kind of a he said, she said, and so they ended up not pursuing it. But that got on the record, and they got called, those 2 girls, and they testified about that event. Which kind of revealed that Kelly had a bit of a harder life that he didn't share with his wife necessarily, because he had this collection, which I'm sure he tried at least to hide from her. She may well have found it, but I would doubt that he flaunted it to her. I don't know that, but that's my suspicion. She never mentioned it, at least. Then another time, he was arrested in January of 1914, because at the very end of 1913, he had dropped out of the Presbyterian seminary. He'd actually been kicked out because he hadn't paid his bills, and he went to Winter, South Dakota. Oh, that's a town in east central South Dakota, maybe a little south of the center. And when the railroad came through to South Dakota, it was going through a town about 4 miles south of Winter. They both were just Winter was just plotted. It wasn't. There was no buildings there, just a space. And south of it, there was a town that had 2 or 3 buildings. And the railroad was going, but the group that had plotted the town of Winter got together, and they persuaded the railroad to shift their line 4 miles north and go through what was winter. They gave them a more attractive incentive to come. And so the railroad did that. And so they went down then, and probably in cooperation with the people, they put those buildings in that little town that didn't no longer exist and moved them up, and that became the founding properties in winter. And they named the town Winter because it was the winter. It won the struggle to be opened, and he was preaching in the Methodist church there. And
What did the end of the trial look like? So he's presented in court with all of this evidence. What did the end of the trial look like?
in the end of the trial, the jury deliberated for quite some time, days rather than hours, and the jury was had started out with a split with Kelly being acquitted, had like a one-person majority, like it was 6-7 to 5, that kind of thing. It was close, and they kept talking, and people shifted so that it was 11 for acquittal, and one for conviction was for conviction, or excuse me, acquittal by reason of insanity. He was guilty of the murder, but he was insane. And that was by a guy, Farmer Brown. He was a farmer, but he's also a banker. He also had bank connections in Red Oak, not in Villisca. And the Wilkerson said that he was on the jury because everyone knew he would stay for conviction regardless, and he did. He refused to change. And after several days, 4 days, we could look that up. I can't tell you the exact days, but they voted 11-1 for acquittal. And the one also voted for acquittal, but it was by reason of insanity, and they've got to be unanimous on a murder trial. At that time, at least, I think they still do. I don't know. But anyway, that meant that the state had lost the trial unless they retried him, which they did. And they retried him just about a month later. It was cool. It was quick, and that was a kind of an afterthought because they didn't call the witnesses that were the same. They just read the testimony that they had. They had a court reporter, and he read what they testified to at the original trial. So it was largely a repeat. They both sides brought in some witnesses, but it was more a few rather than a lot to explain it. And it rather quickly, they had a very short deliberation, and he was acquitted. It was a different jury. They brought in new jurors, but they acquitted him 12-0, and he was freed of that.
Rich, what do you got for Ed?
A interesting sordid story about Reverend Kelly. What happened to Reverend Kelly after the two trials? Did he disappear? Did he get into other issues at other places?
That's I think that's something I followed for years, trying to find out what happened to Reverend Kelly. Where did he go? one of the things I wanted to do if I ever got the book finished was to give a synopsis of the life of the people that were central to the murder after the murder, because they, if they left Villisca, they tended to be forgotten. I mean, everyone knew about Reverend Kelly because of the trials, but nobody knew what happened to him. Uh, but after a lot of work and some real help from a volunteer genealogist, I've not done any genealogy of my own. I got a pretty complete rundown. He came east. he he, uh, um, he was preaching in Howells, New York. I'm not at all sure that still exists, but it was a little town in far western New York. And from there, in 1921, that's about 4 years after the election, he went to oh my gosh, my mind is I'm losing it. He went to down in New Jersey, Chester, New Jersey, and when I was in grad school, I had an extended weekend living in Nashville, and I thought, well, let's go to Chester. I told my wife, who was also in grad school down there, and she said, I don't want to go to Chester, Jersey. That's 1,000 miles from here. It's not quite that far, but it's 900 miles from where we were. And I said, well, I'm going to go. I can get there. I leave here on Saturday morning, drive all day. I can get there by Saturday night. I can stay all day Sunday, drive back and get here Monday night. And then classes start on Tuesday. Well, she said, that's fine with me. You go. And I did. She's been supportive of my puttering around with these strange topics all my life, and so on. Uh, she's upstairs and said, no, I won't come down and do the wash as I should until your interview's over. But anyway, I drove to Chester and I went to the Congregational Church because the record showed that he had preached at the Congregational Church. And I had a series of just dynamite interviews in there, in that thing. The pastor came out. I knocked on his front door. He'd gone up a series of steps. It's a big porch. He came out and I introduced myself. I said, I'm from Iowa. I was doing research into an Iowan event that involved a person who served as pastor of this church after that event. And he said, don't tell me. Let me guess. I know who it was. It was Kelly, wasn't it? And I said, yes, it was. How did you know that? He said, well, he's a storied figure. I mean, he's a person, because he was so peculiar, so strange, that everybody remembered him. And I said, well, he was memorable in Iowa too. And he gave me the list of, I think, 4 people who had been parishioners when Kelly was preaching in 1921 to 1924. This was in the late 60s, so it was not a impossible separation. They were all older, but they were all intelligent and sharp and pretty much willing. The one frustrating thing I had in the interview, I interviewed this lady who was 80 probably, and she said that she knew Kelly well, and as all of them said, he was a pretty good pulpit preacher. I mean, people liked his sermons, but he was pretty strange. And for example, we learned you don't sit in the front row because when he got excited, spittle came out of his mouth, and there were people joked about taking an umbrella to church and things like that. And the 2 of them were nicknamed Mosey and Josie. I'm not sure who was which, his wife and him. and uh, he would be blazing along at top speed, 4 or 5 steps ahead of her, and she, who was a foot taller and had good longer legs, she would be at a kind of a dog trot trying to keep up, and they walked all over town. Kelly bought a car. Yeah, that's the only time I know he had a car in Chester, and he taught himself to drive in the backyard, knocked down his neighbor's fence. He went through neighbor's fence with the car, things like that. He also had a pet parrot that he got, and a bunch of the boys from his. He had taught the parrot Bible verses, I suppose, things like Jesus loves and things like that. Maybe slay utterly, I don't know. But then uh, when he when he wasn't supervising it, these boys that were in his Christian Endeavor class that met in the manse sometimes, he they taught the parrot profanity. So Kelly got so angry because the parrot was liable to blurt out a profaning word. Uh, but anyway, this woman, I asked her, um, "Did you have direct contact?" She said, "Yes, yes." She said he came over once uh, to my house. Yeah, I don't know if it's the house she was living in then or not. I don't think so. So he came over to my house, and I said, "Well, come in. We'll have tea and talk about it. It was some church business." And he said, "Is your husband home?" And she said, "I was kind of surprised that I didn't know." And I said, "Well, no, he's at work." He said, "Well, I couldn't come in then." And she said, "Well, I've been a little suspicious of that ever since. I wasn't thinking of any uh, violation of mores to come into the house with the husband there, but he was." And so you got that little kind of a tidbit. He was the chaplain of the Ku Klux Klan chapter in Chester.
That's odd.
That's interesting.
I've never heard that before.
Yes, he was. He was. That's what they told me, at least.
Kelly,
And
you're telling me Reverend Kelly was a chaplain of the Ku Klux Klan.
that's right. And I don't know exactly how the Klan was organized, but I think it was the local chapter. This was in the 1920s when it had a revival, or a national revival. There were chapters all over Iowa at that time. They were primarily anti-Catholic. They weren't nearly as racial in their focus as they were. They were anti-black, and they were anti-immigrants, and they were anti-Catholic. They had a rally in Chester, and he gave the invocation as the chaplain of the group, and then they marched through the city. They were doing that all over one place or another. There's one other thing about Chester that most people don't know because it wasn't memorable, but I thought about it. About that time, Chester was chosen by the soap company that produced Cove Power. I don't know if you've ever heard of Cove Power, but it was a soap that was sold uh, to, you could wash your clothes in cold water and save the energy and the money, uh, and it would come out just as clean as if you'd used hot water. And so to prove that, they went to Chester and they gave every woman, I think, that wanted it or would accept it, a month's supply, year's supply, I don't know how long, as an advertising promotion. And then it was on TV, and they would interview Mrs. Smith from Chester, New Jersey, the center, the cleanest, where the people have the cleanest clothes in cold water in the nation. And I thought to myself, I wonder if Kelly could have washed his garments in cold water and got the stain out of them. Um,
Did
anyway,
did the authorities ever determine whether the blood was of animal blood or if it was human blood?
no,
And
no.
and then my other question is going to be, how long was he in the KKK for? Do you have any more info on his?
I don't. The whole Klan collapsed shortly thereafter. So I'm sure that uh, he said he was anti-Catholic. That was his primary motivation. I don't know. He actually was pretty liberal. I've got a sermon, or at least the title of a sermon, is why Christ would be a Christian socialist today. Well, that's a pretty liberal concept in 1920s. This was back in 1912. Uh, so that it wasn't the case that he was a outright bigot by everyone thinks, but he was. I think his family, Kelly, is a Irish, or I think he was in. He's Ulster Irish, is what I think. He his family, I think, was um, they were in the part of Ireland that was settled by Scotch, that was shifting down. A lot of Scotch Irish came to the United States, and consequently, I think that probably he was bitterly anti-Catholic related to the conflict that they were having back in the British Isles, or his family was having in the British Isles. He uh, a couple of other elements of the trial, though, I do want you to know about. Uh, he was these two girls. They testified, but the one of the crucial parts of evidence was his early knowledge of the murder and his talking about the murder before the house was open. He um, he left Villisca at 5:19 in the morning, and he went west on the main line of the CB&Q Railroad through Red Oak onto a little junction where the train would drop off passengers because there was a branch line that ran from Sidney, Iowa, which is way down in the right on the Missouri border, north, another 50 miles beyond that. And it's called Hastings Junction, which is where the Lizzie Borden uncle lived. And he was a farmer, I think. So he lived out in the country, but it was at Hastings Junction. A couple named Simmons, S S I can't remember. They, husband and wife in their 70s, they had gone to Sydney on Friday night to visit relatives. They were originally from Sydney. They were now living in a little town called Carson, which was just a few miles up the railroad from Macedonia. So Kelly got on the train at 5:19. The murder wasn't discovered till 7:30 or later, but probably around 7:30. And Kelly came west, and at about a little after 7, he was sitting on the train, or he got off of the mainline train and got on the branch line train to go up to Macedonia. And there on the car was sitting the Simmons, the two of them. And he, somewhere I learned, somebody said it had wicker seats. You remember wicker seats in a railroad car? They had a few, and it was a wooden car. And he said he came walking down the aisle and he recognized them as parishioners in his church. And he put his hand on the seat backs standing in the aisle and said the most terrible thing in the history of the world happened in Villisca last night. A whole family was wiped out. And they said he was nervous and agitated and excited about it and talking about it. And he sat across the aisle from them. They thought nothing about it because in the newspapers that day, uh, they started to get news articles about the murder in Villisca, which confirmed what he had said. They did not report that at the time because they assumed that it had been discovered before he left. They didn't pay any attention to the timing of it, and they let it go. Um, Later, when the trial started to build up and they started doing research, they found out that he had talked to two people besides, or in addition to the Simmons, he had talked to them about whether or not, uh, well, the killer had done this or done that, made some comment about it. And so they realized that there was a case that they could make that he had talked about the murder before it had been discovered. And the state, I don't know why they botched this thing up, but they did. They had a fellow named Barrett, Bartlett, something like that, who they thought was. He also claimed that after Kelly got off the train, while they were standing in the station, he told him about it. Well, he was in his 70s and not so sharp. He was starting to have trouble with memory. I can't remember his name, but he was also having trouble with memory. But anyway, he on the stand, they ripped him apart because he said Kelly had come to Macedonia in the fall of 1912 or the fall of 1911, a year before. And that's clear evidence he did not. He didn't come until the month before the murder in the late spring of 1912. So the jury dismissed his testimony because they thought the other. They also ripped the elderly couple pretty hard. Kelly had a good defense lawyer. He they asked him, well, did you know it was how do you know it was on the day of the murder? Maybe it was a week later. And they said, well, uh, we don't remember the date, but it was early in June. So the state had gone then to the railroad, and they got, which I think is the most damning evidence against Kelly. They found ticket records from Sydney, Iowa, to Carson, Macedonia, and now Sydney, Iowa to Carson, Iowa, and during the month of June, there was only one Monday when two tickets were bought from Sydney for Carson, and that was on the 10th of June. Well, that's the couple that testified, and they found Kelly's ticket, not by name, but the fact that he left on the 519 train to Hastings Junction, transferred to the Carson train, and there were 7 people who did that, but he was the only one who had left Villisca. And one of the tickets had been sold in Villisca, and the other 6 had been sold in Red Oak or some other town, and they all got on the same train. But it showed Kelly and these 2 people who testified meeting there on the 10th of June. That answered that. Well, the defense lawyer, made a great deal out of the fact that this is not testimony. These are records, and we don't have any evidence that this is the man you're talking about. I mean, you say it, but you can't prove it. You don't have a person that'll testify that, yes, I sold the ticket. And they asked the guy that sold the tickets, do you remember selling it to these 2 people? Well, no. I said, I sold hundreds of tickets during the month of June. I don't remember, but it's in my record. I made a record every day as to who bought it, or not who bought it, where they bought it, when they bought it, and where they were going. And then he also attacked, you don't know about the time. Maybe it was later. Maybe they didn't leave it 5 and 18. And it's been 5 years now, who remembers? And the only evidence I have against that argument, I talked to the fellow who was, he lived in Red Oak, Iowa, and he was a student of the Burlington Railroad, the CB&Q. He wrote a book about it. He's a knowledge expert on the, and I asked him, I said, well, from your judgment, what you know of the railroad, would the CB&Q's time schedule be followed? I mean, or would it be like today, you buy an Amtrak ticket and you might be 6 hours late? He said, would it be late? And he really, he almost curled his lip, as he turned to me and said, the CB&Q in 1912 would have been on the advertised. If they said they were leaving at 5:19, they would have left at 5:19. So anyway, that's the primary case against him. There were lots of witnesses, character witnesses, and things like that. But the real case against him was that. In my judgment, and I'm not a lawyer, but in my judgment, he would have been convicted if they had a change of venue.
What do you mean? Where would so you're talking about if they had taken the case elsewhere?
Yeah, because he was tried in Red Oak, Iowa, which is 13 miles from Villisca, and it's the county seat of Montgomery County, which Villisca is in. That's why that's the logical place that he would have been tried. But the county of Montgomery by 1917 had divided, so you won or lost the case by who you got on the jury. I could have put together a jury of 12 people who would have unanimously convicted or acquitted Kelly if Jesus Christ had testified on his behalf. No doubt in my mind. On the other hand, I could have gotten 12 who would have convicted him, no matter what was said. The county was split. Wilkerson, in the summer of 17, leading up to the trial, Kelly was arrested in May of 12. He then he turned himself in, actually. He had been living in Alto Pass, Illinois, which is a little town southeast of St. Louis. And Wilkerson came down and got him and took him to Chicago. And they discussed, Wilkerson's advisors and his committee discussed all kinds of things. One, ship him to Australia. Then they can't have the trial. They could, but the chance of them getting them to be extradited probably wouldn't happen. And they decided not to do that, and he'd be better off to stand trial, and they thought they could beat it, and so they brought him back, and he turned himself in. But during that summer after that, Wilkerson went on a speaking tour. He went to every town in Southwest Iowa. They estimate, the state estimates that he spoke to 20,000 people. That's pretty hard when you're in a town of 300. You can go from one of those together, but people flocked to that. And he would, some of them had what they called headlight meetings, in which they would get a ring of cars, they'd turn on their headlights, and he would stand in the middle and speak, and the people would arrange themselves around that. Most of them, though, took place outdoors. Most of them took place in the evening. And Havner, the state attorney general who was going to prosecute the case, he hired a court reporter to get in the stand in the back and take shorthand notes of what was said. And there are a dozen of those of transcripts in the State Historical Society in Des Moines. I don't know if anybody in Villisca's ever read any of those. That one of my frustrations is the people in Villisca think they have the truth because they got it at their mother's knee. But Mama was part of either the Jones or the Kelly side. And once they picked sides, then they didn't get the truth. They got that side and nothing else. And
I'm wondering if there are electronic versions of those notes. It might be worth even calling
they're transcribed. There are a fair number of them in my file cabinet where I made copies of them. And, you know, Wilkerson was a stem winding speaker. I mean, he got an incredible history of his own, which we haven't been talking about, but we could someday. Anyway, he would stand up in front of the crowd, and one of the phrases that I liked the best was he said, "They're trying to convict that little minister." Little minister is significant because the guy that wrote the
is it the
English,
Killer on the Train or something, or Killer by the Train? Is that the book you're talking about?
No. This is long. I live in the past, not the present. He, Peter Pan, the guy that wrote Peter Pan.
Oh,
help me.
I'm not sure who wrote Peter Pan.
He's an English author. Good heavens.
While we try to get the answer to this quickly, Rich, do you have any final questions for Ed?
I do. Ed, what finally happened to Reverend Kelly?
Yeah.
At the end of his life?
Well, let me give you what chronological. I don't have a complete record, but he was in Chester from 21 to 24. From there, he went to right outside of.
I just checked
Hartford,
out on
Hartford, Connecticut.
I just looked on Google, and the author of Peter Pan is J.M. Barrie.
Yes.
Barrie, I believe that's correct.
That was made, by the way, into a movie not very long ago with the the Hollywood actor who does all of those unusual things. All of the Caribbean, the lead actor in the Caribbean shows.
But back to where Kelly ended up.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah,
had
I'm
just
gonna try to
mentioned that you had just mentioned that he got to Connecticut. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that's right. He preached in Hartford, Connecticut for a while. When he left Chester, he went directly to New York City. I don't know how long he was there, but in the late 20s, 27, 28, he ended up in Hartford, Connecticut, or actually he was outside of Hartford, preaching in a congregational church. He had gotten ordained in the congregational church while he was at Chester. He then he got in trouble, got fired there because he got in a fight with his board over the choir. He sponsored a choir. He left and went back to New York City. And in 1930, he was living in New York City, and he was counted twice in the census of 1930. He was counted in New York City, and he was working as a minister, a day minister, in the Bowery Mission Church, which is a fairly famous church. I'd certainly heard of it somewhere along the line. And they have records of him preaching there. And but then, not more than a month or two after he took the census in New York, well, less than that, about a month, he ended up in the mental hospital in far western New York. And that was a hospital for the indigent, the people who had no resources, and that's where they would end up if they were judged insane by the state of New York. And that's since been closed, no longer exists. That was the hospital. I'm struggling with the name. I could look it up, but I don't want to do that right now.
Did he die in the mental hospital?
No, not there. Um, but then in 1941, he had I think, let's see, was that, he got a draft card, but I think that might have been in 1917. But he was preaching in the, what was the successor to the Bowery Mission Church. And his wife was still living with him. And in 1947, towards Christmas, I don't remember the exact date, he and his wife went to a hospital in Manhattan. And she died in the waiting room of the hospital. I don't know what her trouble was. She was 80 years old when she died, 12 years older than Lynn. Lynn had been dropped, by the way. In the East, he called himself George Jacqueline Kelly, which was his official name. Lynn was a name he attached in honor of his mother, I think. Kelly died in 1959, and he was in the mental hospital. He died in the mental hospital in Islip, Central Islip Mental Hospital in on Long Island. They had a series of mental hospitals they built on Long Island, big institutions. I mean, thousands of patients, and everybody from the boroughs got shipped to those. They went out kind of like stair stepped out. A Central Islip was a town, I think. Islip is there, Central Islip. I don't know if there's an East, or I think there's an East Islip. I've not been to those. He was, his death certificate reads that he died of arterial sclerosis and he was psychotic at death.
Wow.
I figure what happened. I don't know what happened in that 12 years. I don't know how long he was there. But I don't think he would ever have been able to function for a long time without his wife. I think she was a stabilizing influence. And I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't get sent to there to the mental hospital from Manhattan in short order after she died. Now, I don't know that, but sometime in the 12 years after she died, he also died at 80. He was 8 or 12 years younger. They both are buried side by side in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx.
The death of Reverend Kelly. This has been a crazy episode.
This has been a very revealing episode about the Villisca case and the trials and tribulations, literally the trials and tribulations of Reverend Kelly.
Ed, I want to thank you so much for taking a couple of hours out of your day to appear on the show.
One last thing, it's in an unmarked grave, and I think it was a potter's field owned, I believe, by the church that he was working with. I believe his burial was financed by the what had been the Bowery Mission Church, and I think it's now called the Central Mission Church or something like that. But there's no tombstone, things like that. But
Interesting.
it's in the church records. I have a copy of what the grave is. It's an identified grave. Yeah, and there are 126 or something people buried in that section. Very few of them have tombstones. I've thought a little bit, if I were a little wealthier person, I might buy a tombstone and have it put out there, but I haven't gotten around to that yet. I'll have to wait till I get old.
For everybody in the audience who may not have seen the first episode, Ed surprised Rich and I both with his age. He is 90. I could not believe that.
Unless he's had a birthday since.
Yes.
No, I haven't. It'll be September before I become 91.
Ed is the author of Fiend Incarnate. Rich, while I grab the book, do you want to talk a little bit about the book?
Yes. Very, very interesting. We're going to show it right now. I'm going to show it right now. This is Ed's book. By his own admission, it took him a little bit of time to put this together.
Over 60 years, if I'm remembering correctly. 60 years, I think it says on the back of the book, of research. Ed has also appeared in a TV documentary, and that is called what, Ed? I can't remember.
Villisca, Living with a Mystery.
Villisca, Living with a Mystery. So if you guys just can't get enough.
Yeah, it came out in 2004. So it's been on the market a long time.
Very nice. I haven't seen it. I need to see it. But if you guys just can't get enough of the Villisca case, we do have a part 1 of the Villisca case with Ed, where he came in and detailed the crime scene for us and the case itself. And that was a fascinating deep dive as well. Rich, what else do we have coming up on the calendar?
Coming up next is going to be this book,
San Francisco Homicide Inspector 5 Henry 7 by Frank Falzon. Frank Falzon, for anybody who watched the Night Stalker episode, is the arresting officer of the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. And we are so excited to have Frank on the show. That was confirmed earlier in the week. I believe it was on Monday. I confirmed it via email. But we've done 2 episodes on the Night Stalker, one where you and I just sat down and detailed the case. And then we did a 2-hour deep dive with Eli Frankel on the Night Stalker case, where he tells Frank's story. So we are so excited to have had that connection. Shout out to Eli for making that connection. And what else do we got coming up?
And after that, in the middle of May, we are going to be interviewing
Eric J. Dolan from Left for Dead. And that's going to be kind of like a 2-part episode, because this book came out in 2024, Eric J. Dolan's Left for Dead. But he also has releasing in the middle of May, The Wreck of the Mentor. So we are going to be discussing the new book and Left for Dead. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to be 2 episodes or if that's going to be 1 long episode, but we'll find out. We'll see what works, and we'll make it a great episode for you guys.
I've just finished Left for Dead.
What'd you think of it?
And if you are historically inclined, this takes you back to the War of 1812 and what happened when people were marooned in the Falkland Islands and the trials and tribulations of being there for nearly 2 years alone.
Wow. And I got to give a little bit of a shout out on our wide camera for our guest today, the axe, the Villisca axe that we displayed in the background for you guys. No, not the real Villisca axe, just one that I grabbed from my backyard. But I thought it was a fun little piece of...
Looks like about the same size.
It probably is, Yeah. And then I do want to give a shout out to David for the artwork in the background. His link is always in the description if you guys are looking for some Gothic landscape portraits. David's a great artist, and he always sponsors the show. So thank you very much, David. With that, Ed, I want to give you a huge thank you for coming on to the show.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Always.
Yes, it certainly was a interesting revelation about about Villisca and what happened after Villisca. We've got some busy weeks coming up. We've had a busy week this last week with the show that I was involved with.
Surviving the Survivor. Rich was just on Surviving the Survivor, as well as Joel being on TSRP. So if you guys want to see a STS, Surviving the Survivor, episode with Rich regarding the Lizzie Borden case, that episode is now live. And it was a great episode. It was I think it was like a 75-minute interview about the Lizzie case. Joel asked some great questions,
and that's doing very, very well as far as viewership. So that one is out there, and we got some more news coming in the future, and more new episodes and more new authors. And I personally want to thank all of you for your comments and for your suggestions. And if you haven't been a subscriber, we really appreciate if you would check that box.
Absolutely. Ed and I talked on the phone briefly yesterday, and we discussed the idea of doing a live stream at some point.
Soon,
regarding the Villisca case. For all of you guys in the comments section that want to ask Ed a direct question, there will be a live stream coming up at some point regarding the case. So we'll figure it out. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And with that, I think we're going to close out this episode of TSRP.
Yes, well, thank you very much, and thank you to Ed, and thank you to you, Seth, and thank you to you out there, everybody. Have a great week.
All right, thank you. Bye, guys.